the sound on? Can you hear it? All right. Good morning. So good to see everybody's shiny, bright faces here and ready to go. Old friends and new friends coming in. We appreciate your attendance. This must be the 40th or 42nd or something. Do we know how many this is? 41st? All right. The 41st in His Image Scientific Assembly. I'm extremely pleased. I get to introduce one of our own to start out this morning. She's from the land of milk and honey. She's in private practice and is one of our best residents, has come back to share a little bit this morning. Dr. Kelly Windsor, if you'd please come up.
Good morning. It is so good to be with y'all and be in your presence this morning, and I just enjoy coming back and seeing your faces every year so much, and it's really a privilege just to be a part of this IHI family. And for those of you coming in as first-year residents, well, you're in for a treat. Residency's hard, but it is so wonderful, too, just to be part of like-minded doctors who are teaching you and pouring into you. So. Anyway, I don't really know why they asked me to do the devotional. I'm sure there's many people who are more qualified and have better stories than me. But I feel like if someone asked me to share about what God's been doing in my life or about what He's been teaching me, that I shouldn't say no. So here I am. Just want to start with a prayer. Dear Father, I just thank you so much for this morning. Thank you for bringing us all here safely. And Lord, I thank you for this retreat that we get to have. Thank you for the leaders of In His Image. I just pray for them, that you will continue to guide them. Bless this program, Father, and just be with all the residents this weekend, those who are graduating, those who are coming in, and those who are persisting, and just pray that this will be a special weekend for them too, Father. Lord, as we open your word, I just pray that you will open our minds to understand your scriptures, as it says in Luke 24, and that we will just gain a better knowledge and grow nearer to you each day, Father. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So recently I've been doing some repetitive reading and meditating over the book of Mark. I will admit that Mark has kind of always been my least favorite of the four Gospels. I think because it was the shortest and I felt like it left out some of the other stories that were my favorites in some of the other Gospels. And so I haven't really focused on Mark very much in my life. I've been more of a Luke and John and occasionally Matthew type of person. And just recently, I've just been so blessed by Mark. And I just want to share a few little things that I've learned. Mark, it is shorter, but he's very to the point, and he has a purpose to show that Jesus is truly the divine Son of God. And he intentionally points to that from the beginning, and is the sense of urgency, like you have to know who Jesus is. And so I love that about it. And this book is full of the word immediately. I think that's his favorite word. In a span of 16 chapters, the word immediately is said 39 times. And so it kind of starts sticking out to you almost in an annoying way when you start reading the whole book at once. You're like, immediately, okay, immediately Jesus does this, and you're like, was it really immediately? But part of the neat factor of things happening immediately is that that's not how they usually work in our lives. If someone's going to be healed, we usually don't see them healed immediately. It's over a span of days or weeks or years sometimes, or if we ask for God for something, we typically don't just see it appear immediately. And so that also just speaks of Jesus' divinity and his authority over nature. And so I love that about the book of Mark too. We're going to focus on Mark chapter 6. I'm going to read kind of a long passage, but we will kind of go through and learn from Mark chapter 6 this morning. So starting in verse 7, I'm going to read verses 7 through 13, and then I'm going to skip to verse 30. If I can see over the microphone. He summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs and gave them authority over unclean spirits. He instructed them to take nothing for the road except a staff, no bread, no traveling bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on an extra shirt. He said to them, "Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that place. If any place does not welcome you or listen to you, when you leave there, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons, anointed many sick people with oil, and healed them. Skipping down to verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going. They did not even have time to eat. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, "This place is deserted, and it is already late. Send them away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat." "You give them something to eat," he responded. They said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" He asked them, "Well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. He kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of them to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. Well into the night, the boat was in the middle of the sea. He was alone on the land. He saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Very early in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea and wanted to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. My husband teaches a Sunday school class weekly, and the first thing he always asks whenever we finish reading a scripture is, "What stands out to you?" So I just want to ask you all, is there anything about the scripture that we just read that really stands out to you, either in a way that, wow, that's very impressive, or that's kind of strange, I don't understand that? Does anybody have any thoughts this morning? Yes, definitely. God's provision. Yes. Hearts were hardened. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. And yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes. Um,
Look at what you have in your hands to use
mhm.
and break your problems up into manageable pieces. Don't try to do it all in one big group.
Right. Such good points. So yes, that was one of the first things that stood out to me was like, I think I've felt that way before, where I've been working intentionally for the kingdom, trying to do my job in a way that I'm both offering physical healing but pointing people to the real healer. And there's always someone, coming to me with something new, every day. It's more patients and more problems. And then I think I'm going to go to a remote place and rest. And then I get there, and then there's more people needing things. Or there's 3 kids who are all tugging on me in different directions. And And sometimes it feels overwhelming, right? And we forget that God is there with us. Yeah, so that was one of the first things that stood out. And just the fact that after that it says Jesus had compassion on the crowd, and he viewed them as sheep without a shepherd. And that reminds me of Psalm 23, when it says, "The Lord is my shepherd," and then it says, "He will make me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul." And so this, in a way, is kind of a fulfillment of Psalm 23, realistically in the disciples' lives. And perhaps, they could have rested then if they would have just sat at his feet and listened with the crowd. But they were probably so worried about the crowd that they didn't have time to just sit there and listen to him. So I think the disciples' reaction to being told to give the crowd something to eat is interesting, as I think someone else mentioned. I wonder, when they were told, well, you give them something to eat, would they have thought back maybe to the time when Peter and Andrew and James and John also, they're in the boat, and they had been fishing all night long, and they hadn't caught anything, and then Jesus shows up, and it's like, oh, toss your nets on the other side, and I think you'll catch something. And Jesus is like, well, we've been fishing all night. It's not going to work. But then they decide, okay, well, I guess we'll trust you and do it. And then they put the nets on the other side, and they draw in this huge net load of fish that's about to sink the boat. Would they have thought of that and been like, hey, Jesus, you did that miracle that time. Can you do that again? And then we'll have enough fish to feed all these people. Or would they have thought, maybe back to 2 Kings chapter 4, where Elisha, not Elijah. Elisha multiplies loaves. I'd forgotten about this passage till just recently. I was reading back on that, and he takes 20 loaves and turns it into enough bread to feed 100. And these are small loaves, So this has happened before, and it's like Jesus is saying, I can take these 5 loaves and turn it into enough to feed 5,000. I am greater than Elisha, greater than Elijah. So would they have thought about that and thought, like, this man who is with us is the Son of God. Like, he's greater than these prophets, so surely he can feed these 5,000 people. But yet, their faith was little, and how often I'm the same way. I look at only my little resources and think this is impossible. Right after he feeds all the 5,000, it says they have 12 basketfuls left over, which was enough for each disciple to have a basket. Also enough to symbolize maybe that he was the Savior for the 12 tribes of Israel, that these disciples would become the 12 patriarchs of the new Israel. There's a lot of symbolism there and speculation on what the numbers mean, but I think we're supposed to ponder on those numbers. Right after that, he tells them to get into the boat and to leave, go to the other side of the sea. And John's gospel clarifies why Jesus was immediately told them to leave. The crowd recognized Jesus after that miracle as the promised prophet or the promised Messiah, and they wanted to make him king. They were trying to seize him by force and force him to be their king. And I can envision them kind of this 5,000 men, like, we're going to make an army and we're going to go take over and kick out the Romans and everything. They were looking, though, for an earthly savior, someone to rescue them from physical hunger and suffering. They wanted him to give them that physical bread every day. They weren't so much interested in the spiritual bread. And they didn't recognize that he wanted to deliver them from spiritual oppression, not from physical oppression. So they get in the boat. They're still tired, like you said. Now they're rowing against this wind. And it's, they probably got in the boat between 6 and 9 p.m., and now it's 3 to 6 in the morning. They haven't had any sleep, and they're still rowing and rowing. We got to do this because Jesus told us to. We got to get to the other side of the lake. And what was Jesus doing? I mean, he told them to get in that boat. He knew there was going to be wind, and they knew they weren't going to get anywhere. Have you ever felt that way? Like, Jesus told me to do this, and now I feel like I'm not getting anywhere, and I just can't make it happen. I think Jesus had a purpose for that, though. And so sometimes in the middle of our struggle, there is purpose, and he's trying to teach us something. The next verse says Jesus wanted to pass by them. And I've always viewed that verse kind of like a children's Bible version, where it's like, you see the disciples in the boat, and the wind's blowing, the boat's going which way, and then Jesus is kind of like, hey guys, see you on the other side. And that's the way I pictured that verse, like he's going to pass by them, and like, so long, like, good luck. That's not at all what the verse means, I don't think. And so I want to just read a few verses from the Old Testament that pointed me a little more in the right direction recently when meditating on Mark. Job chapter 9, verses 8 and 11 says, "He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. If he passed by me, I wouldn't see him. If he went by, I wouldn't recognize him." Exodus 33, verses 18 and 19 and 22. Moses said, "Please let me see your glory." He said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. Here's a place near me. You are to stand on the rock, and when my glory passes by, I will put you in the crevice of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." And in 1 Kings 19, verse 11, Elijah is on Mount Horeb, and it says, "At that moment the Lord passed by." So sometimes when we are in those storms, Jesus is watching us, and he is just yearning for us to see him and see his glory. He passes by us so we will know that he is near and that we can reach out to him for help, and so we will see his glory in the midst of our struggle. When he got in the boat with the disciples, it says they were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. And I question, do I understand about the loaves? What is this link between the loaves and them recognizing Jesus' power over the storm? Perhaps there's sometimes that I just miss the point because it's kind of hard for me to see that link when I'm like, why didn't they say they had not understood about the first time Jesus was in the boat with him and he calmed the storm? Or they hadn't understood about how Jesus was truly the Son of God. They hadn't, there's a ton of things they could have said there, but they said, Mark says he didn't understand about the loaves. So that caused me to kind of meditate on what were the loaves? What is the meaning of those loaves with the bread? There's a lot of symbolism of bread in the Bible. You think back to the Old Testament, the bread of the presence that was in the Holy of Holies, the manna that came down from heaven. Then when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he replied to Satan, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." And in John 6, verse 35, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." Later, he gives them the Lord's Supper, and his body symbolizes, or the bread symbolizes his body. In Luke 22, verse 19, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So perhaps they were supposed to recognize somehow that this bread that he divided and multiplied at the same time represented him as the bread of life. And it was also a fulfillment of the, he came down from heaven just like the manna in the wilderness. In fact, in later on in, it's Mark 8 or John 6 that I was just reading, the Pharisees don't recognize the sign he's just done. They're still saying, our fathers gave us manna in the wilderness. Why don't you give a sign like that? He just did, And so he is showing that he is the bread that comes down from heaven that provides for us and sustains us and provides for us spiritually salvation. And they didn't recognize it. Their hearts were hard. When I question, do I understand about the loaves or do I miss the point here? I think there's probably a lot of times in my life that I miss the point in what God is trying to do, that I'm just stuck out there in the middle of the boat, struggling against the waves and not seeing what he's trying to teach me. So I reflected a little bit on what might cause me to not understand. Number one, sometimes I'm focused too much on myself, my own shortcomings, and my own appetites. Sometimes I just don't study or meditate or ponder enough. I get busy, and I just fail to sit down with his word and think about my day, think about what I've been experiencing, and letting my experiences really sink in light of God's love and his plans. Or sometimes I limit God. I rely on my own calculations instead of on God's infinite resources. Charles Swindoll wrote about this about the book of Mark. 3 times in 3 consecutive chapters, 8, 9, and 10, Mark pictured Jesus informing his disciples of his great sacrifice and ultimate victory. His disciples either rejected the teaching altogether or they showed themselves concerned with other matters. As Jesus prepared to perform the greatest service in the history of the human race, his disciples could only think about themselves, their position, their safety. This is worth reflecting on. Am I ever more concerned about my position or my safety than I am about Jesus' sacrifice and victory? Do I ever find myself more focused on worldly victory than sacrificial service? I just want to end this morning by reading a verse out of 2 Corinthians. I didn't write it down, so just be patient as I turn there real quick. 2 Corinthians 9, verses 8 through 11. God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. As it is written, He distributed freely, He gave to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now the one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food will also provide and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all generosity, which produces thanksgiving to God through us. And I pray that will be true in each of our lives.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for sharing, Kelly. Welcome to our annual scientific assembly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, our second years have worked hard, and this is their, not quite the culmination, they'll also be published, but this is a big part of their research requirement here at In His Image. They're all not nervous, you're calm, cool, collected, ready to go. Okay. Well, first, I have some announcements, some details that you all will want to know. First, in order for you to, hey, Caleb Owsley, hey, to be approved for attendance, you need to, after the presentation, complete an evaluation, and it needs to be turned in at the end of this morning, and then you'll have another sheet for tomorrow morning. Residents, this is how we know you attend. For those who have graduated, this is how you get CME credit, so please make sure you have a sheet and a pencil. There's pencils around. Our presenters will have 30 minutes, 25 minutes to present and 5 minutes for questions, and we will be sticking to those guidelines pretty strictly. We do have some esteemed alumni who have agreed to evaluate research as well as the presentations. So I would like to recognize Dr. Paul Williams. Dr. Paul, hey, Dr. Williams. Dr. Beatrice Abraham, who does not look too sleep deprived for her OB fellowship. Dr. Joel Tumlison, this is actually your packet. I'll bring it to you. Yes. Dr. Kelly Windsor, who we've all met this morning already. And Dr. Am I off? It's fine. Dr. Shinfrinko, I have. All right. I believe that's it. Any other announcements? Nope. We're good? All right. So I think when you review our topics for the day and for tomorrow, you will find that our residents have collected information regarding a variety of topics that are really pertinent for our patients. So you'll find some presentations on fibromyalgia. It's a difficult thing to take care of, so hopefully we'll get some help. Medication-assisted treatment, as well as mood disorders. To kick us off, we have Dr. Stacy Phillip and Dr. Mackenzie Monagold, who will be talking about fibromyalgia and treatment. Please, come up, ladies.
Are we on? Can we hear us?
Hello.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone, and praise the Lord. What an honor it is to be able to kick off our presentations for today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Stacy Phillip. I'm one of the second years here at IHI.
I'm Mackenzie Monagold. Also second year.
And our project this year is titled The Effectiveness of Gabapentinoids for Pain Reduction in Fibromyalgia. Our advisor was Dr. Amanda Lukashu. When thinking about this project, like Dr. Hildebrand mentioned, a lot of times our patients come to us with the desire to seek for pain, analgesia, just relief, and fibromyalgia is something that can affect every single aspect of your life. And we wanted to be better equipped to help treat them in their mind, their body, their soul, and their spirit. So hopefully you guys will learn some things to help our patients better out this way. So let's dive right into a clinical question. We have here a 44-year-old female who presents to your office reporting that she hurts all over. After performing a thorough history and physical examination and appropriate laboratory studies, you diagnose fibromyalgia. You explain to the patient that the initial treatment recommendation with the most proven efficacy is A, acupuncture, B, aerobic exercise, C, amitriptyline, D, duloxetine, and E, tramadol. You don't have to raise your hands, but just kind of keep your answer in your mind, and we will come back to this later.
Okay, so fibromyalgia, it is a very common cause of widespread musculoskeletal pain. It's often accompanied by fatigue, cognitive disturbances, psychiatric symptoms, and then patients also tend to have multiple somatic symptoms as well. The etiology isn't well known, and then the pathophysiology also isn't understood very well, which is why it's difficult to diagnose and treat. And patients tend to have multiple areas of soft tissue pain. It affects muscles, ligaments, tendons, but the difficult part for us, especially as physicians, is there tends to be no evidence of inflammation in these tissues. And then it's like many other chronic pain syndromes, it has been controversial. Patients tend to look well. There's really no laboratory findings. There's no radiologic findings typically. And then they tend to just look pretty well. So a lot of even physicians tend to question this diagnosis as even being real, and some tend to think it's more psychogenic or psychosomatic. But there is some ongoing research that does suggest fibromyalgia is a disorder of pain dysregulation, and people are now classifying it more as a form of central sensitization.
So this diagnosis, it may be under-recognized in clinical practice. The prevalence estimates vary greatly with the specific diagnostic criteria that are applied depending on which organization that you use. And the prevalence of fibromyalgia was much higher using the surveys with standardized criteria than estimates based upon like medical record documentation of the actual diagnosis. And many treatments are both pharmacological and non-pharmacological, and they've been proposed for treating it, such as gabapentinoids, tricyclic antidepressants like amitriptyline, duloxetine, and cyclobenzaprine.
Okay, so there's several different ways to diagnose and different like groups that have put out diagnoses criteria. This one is from the American Pain Society, and you'll just notice, we don't have to go through the whole thing, but you can just notice that multi-site pain and then sleep problems or fatigue, as well as the symptoms being present for at least 3 months are what they use.
And so here, this is another set of diagnostic criteria. Here it's a little bit difficult to read, but the main points are that the 2016 American College of Rheumatology, the fibromyalgia diagnostic criteria requires, again, 3 months of symptom duration, generalized pain affecting at least 4 out of 5 body regions, and the inclusion of scores from the widespread pain index that you'll see here on the bottom left, and the symptom severity score on the right.
So for us family medicine physicians, we definitely want to think about differential diagnoses. Fibromyalgia tends to be more of a diagnosis of exclusion. So you want to think about rheumatologic conditions, and then also people that have diagnosed rheumatologic conditions, if they're not responding well to treatment for those conditions, you might consider comorbid fibromyalgia. And then here's some other more zebra diseases, Lyme disease, hyperparathyroidism, MS, things like that. One of the things about fibromyalgia is you as a physician might not think a patient has it, but just based on the amount of memes online, a lot of patients think that they have it at least. So that's something to keep in mind. So we'll move on to our question and then get right into the research that we did. So our question was, are gabapentinoid medications effective versus placebo for pain control in adult patients with fibromyalgia? And we'll tell you the evidence-based answer, and then we'll come back to it later. But we did find gabapentin and pregabalin do significantly decrease pain in the treatment of fibromyalgia, and the efficacy compared to other treatment options, specifically duloxetine was one we looked at, do require further investigation.
So the first article that we have is called The Treatment of Fibromyalgia Syndrome with Gabapentin and Pregabalin, a Meta-Analysis of Randomized Controlled Trials. It was done in 2009 as a meta-analysis of 6 randomized controlled trials with a sample size of 3,478. The inclusion criteria included adults who have fibromyalgia, and the diagnostic criteria that they used was based off the American College of Rheumatology. And the exclusion criteria included people who were younger than 18 years old, those who had unstable somatic disease or severe mental disorders, those who were applying for disability due to fibromyalgia syndromes, those who were engaged in litigation related to fibromyalgia, as well as those with poor renal functioning with a creatinine clearance less than 60. The treatment group included those with using gabapentin in doses of 1,200 to 2,400 or pregabalin with doses of 150 to 600 milligrams per day. And their control group was placebo. And their outcomes that they measured were primarily pain reduction, as well as secondary outcomes such as sleep, anxiety, depression, fatigue, and health-related quality of life measures. These include things that are including work difficulty, pain, fatigue, morning tiredness, stiffness, as well as anxiety and depression.
So the results that they found was that gabapentinoids did show significant pain reduction. They showed improved sleep function. Better patients reported their fatigue was better, and then their health-related quality of life scores tended to be better as well compared to placebo. They did not find a significant difference in depression scores, and then probably expected where gabapentinoids had a higher withdrawal rate due to adverse effects. Most of those adverse effects were dizziness, somnolence, weight gain, and then peripheral edema, and patients complained of negative neurocognitive effects as well.
So the limitations of this study included the fact that external validity of the studies was limited due to the exclusion of patients with severe mental illness or somatic disorder. As well, the generalizability of this was also affected due to primarily most of the patients were just white females, so distributing it out to further ethnic groups as well as gender is significantly limited here.
So our next study was called Anticonvulsants for Fibromyalgia. It was a 2017 meta-analysis of 8 randomized controlled trials with an N of 2,480. They were a little bit more lax in their inclusion criteria. They allowed any published standardized criteria, diagnosis of fibromyalgia, any age. And then mostly they were just excluding people with co-occurring mental illness, inflammatory diseases like we discussed earlier, and then if they were already being treated with an antidepressant or anticonvulsant medication. And then they also, they looked at all of these medications here. Whenever we were looking at the study, we were more interested in these two right here. The control group got placebo pills, and then they were looking for a 50% pain reduction, and then they were also looking at those factors of quality of life as well.
So the results of this study show that there was not actually a significant difference in pain reduction found for gabapentin, lacosamide, and levetiracetam versus placebo. Pregabalin here had a modest benefit in reducing pain by 50% in fibromyalgia patients when compared with placebo. And the effects of pregabalin compared with placebo in reducing fatigue, depression, anxiety, and the limitations of the health-related quality of life were not actually substantial. And here, there were more dropouts due to adverse effects with pregabalin than with placebo use, and this again was dizziness. That was the most commonly reported side effect of pregabalin.
So I think one of the biggest limitations here was that co-interventions were allowed, and they didn't control for type or dosage. At least it's not clearly controlled for. Some of those co-interventions could be things like physical therapy or things like NSAID use, Tylenol use, things like that. So that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit when you're looking at a specific medication and pain reduction specifically. And then they excluded participants with mental illness, and we know that fibromyalgia has a very high comorbid rate with depression, at least. So that kind of could lead to some generalizability problems as well.
And then our last article was called Comparing Duloxetine and Pregabalin for the Treatment of Pain and Depression in Women with Fibromyalgia. This was a 2019 open-label randomized control clinical trial, and the inclusion criteria included women who were diagnosed with fibromyalgia based on the American College of Rheumatology, the 2010 criteria, and it excluded those who had previously used duloxetine, gabapentin, pregabalin, or antidepressants 12 weeks prior to the study, in addition to those who had comorbid chronic pain, neuropsychiatric disorders, except for major depression and anxiety disorders as well. The treatment group here used duloxetine in dosages of 30 to 60 milligrams, or pregabalin 75 to 150 milligrams over a course of 4 weeks. The control group, they did not have a placebo group to compare to, and their outcomes that they measured were the mean score changes from baseline to endpoint based on the widespread pain index and the Beck Depression Inventory number 2 questionnaires.
So the results here, duloxetine showed some significant improvement on the widespread pain index. Interestingly, there wasn't a difference between the depression scores, even though duloxetine is an antidepressant. So I thought that was interesting. It actually had a higher dropout rate, which surprised me, and increased incidence of nausea. But then you see pregabalin also had some side effects as well. But they didn't really find any significant difference for the other adverse events.
So the limitations of this study included that they had a relatively small sample size, which was highly selected using several exclusion criteria. The sample size was actually 195 people who were screened, and out of that, 99 were selected, and 60 were put into the duloxetine group and 39 into the pregabalin. So very small sample size over a very short period of time. So the short follow-up period with a high number of dropouts does limit its efficacy. We know that also duloxetine sometimes also takes 6 to 8 weeks to work, so not even giving this medication a long enough time to really prove any side effects is a limitation of this study. In addition, it was an open label study with the potential risk of bias, particularly observer bias.
Okay, so back to our evidence-based answer, where we found that gabapentin and pregabalin do significantly decrease pain in the treatment of fibromyalgia. That's a strength of recommendation A based on the systematic review and the meta-analyses that we had. However, the efficacy compared to other treatments, specifically duloxetine, definitely requires further investigation.
So coming back to how does this affect us as family medicine physicians? So as we began to work on this FPIN project, the AAFP actually put out an article in their February 2023 magazine issue all about fibromyalgia. And we thought that this topic was very relevant to outpatient care. In 1996, the American Pain Society actually recognized pain as the 5th vital sign. And so at some point in our life, we're most likely going to experience patients who present to clinics with multiple complaints, and we will need to form a differential diagnosis along with how to work them up and a treatment plan that is kind of patient-centered and just how to get them a better quality of life overall.
Okay, so if you notice in the beginning, the diagnosis criteria from the 2 different groups that we put up there were long and somewhat complicated. But the AAFP put out this, I actually don't know if it came from them, but they put it in their article. It's called the Fibromyalgia Rapid Screening Tool. So if you have someone that you're considering fibromyalgia, as a diagnosis. You could use this tool. There's only 6 points, and if a patient answers yes to at least 5 of them, fibromyalgia is a lot more likely, and you could consider that. But again, it's a diagnosis of exclusion, like we talked about earlier.
So when we're talking about clinical practice, we have many of our faculty who have constantly reminded us about how when you're treating this disorder, that a multimodal way of attacking it from multiple different sites is the most effective. Here we have, you can kind of take a look at some of the dosages that they use, but other types of medicines, even outside of the ones that we had mentioned in our research project, are, again, amitriptyline, cyclobenzaprine, duloxetine, milnacipran or Savella, as well as Lyrica that they have here. And so just being able to realize that there's multiple things that you have in your tool belt to use for this is definitely an option, because sometimes one thing doesn't work, and so just knowing that there's other options that you can turn to is helpful.
Also looking at what other comorbid conditions the patient might have and seeing if there's any medication that could treat more than one thing is appropriate. And I also found this table helpful because it went through the common adverse effects too. So you could talk to your patient, first of all, warn them at the forefront that they might experience some of these things, but also go through if there's anything that they're just like, I can't accept that, then you don't have to try those things. And then also very important is the non-pharmacologic treatments for fibromyalgia. These include things like patient education about the disease process itself, which requires that we know about it. And then exercise is extremely important. Low intensity and low frequency is what is suggested, sorry. Cognitive behavior therapy, we know that that pretty much works for everything, it seems like. And then other forms of complementary alternative medicine, they mentioned yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, but one thing I wanted to point out here is like massage and then myofascial release. So if we have some of our, Stacy and I are both MDs, but if we have some of our DO partners, we can send them over there for some help.
And we also thought that, especially here at IHI, where we really discuss the importance of spiritual care, this is an area where providing that spiritual care is so important. We kind of see in the Bible many times how even Paul recognized that there's a thorn in his flesh, and people who have to go through this, it's a chronic thing that they're trying to just live their daily lives, and it's affecting them. When you hurt all the time, your mental health is affected, it affects your relationships with people, and just recognizing that this is such a critical time for people to be able to be poured into, and just recognize that they're not alone in their suffering. Not only are we walking with them throughout this whole step, but that the Lord is also close to those who are brokenhearted, who are suffering. And just a verse that we wanted to remind you guys about, Romans 5, verses 3 through 5. It says, talks about the glory in our suffering. We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance that develops strength of character, and character the strength of our confident hope of salvation. And so just being able to recognize that sometimes this is part of our testimony, this is part of the story that God is being able to walk us through to show others that we can be a testimony in being able to share with Christ in our suffering, and also being able to use that as a way to comfort others who are also suffering is something that we found very helpful and just a great reminder of when we're taking care of patients.
Okay, so we'll come back to our clinical question. This is a 44-year-old female. She presents to your office reporting that she hurts all over. Stacy Phillip, MD, performs a very thorough history and physical exam and appropriate laboratory studies, and she diagnoses fibromyalgia. You explain to the patient that the initial treatment recommendation with the most proven efficacy is, and the answer is actually aerobic exercise. And you might notice that gabapentinoids are not even included as a possible answer, but we wanted to talk about this question just in the hopes that maybe in the future we'll see gabapentinoids included there or as an option for you guys in your practice.
Yes, this was from the 2022 ABFM ITE exam, and so it is very relevant. And when we're kind of talking more about the answer choices, like we mentioned, aerobic exercise. So that affects every kind of aspect of your body. Getting physical, getting active helps you in multiple aspects of your body, just loosen up your joints, helps you with your mental effect. For those people who love to run, they say that you get that runner's high and the endorphins. So being able to kind of move your body does have so many benefits. In addition to having a balanced diet, good sleep hygiene, and weight reduction, these are all adequate strategies for managing fibromyalgia. And also managing expectations with patients is something also that we found very helpful to, as a good reminder, in order to improve their function and quality of life, as well as managing symptoms. And this was a European study in 2017 that kind of said this, but they said that exercise is the strongest and most critical treatment. But just as a reminder that there's other things that we can help combat this with, such as acupuncture, but by and far most, remember, there's pharmacological and non-pharmacological options to help our patients be able to have the best quality of life.
Here's our references. And we just wanted to say a big thank you to Dr. Amanda Lukashu, who's our advisor. She couldn't be here today. Hopefully she's able to watch it online. I don't know, we'll see. But we're also very grateful to IHI, especially Dr. Hildebrand, Dr. Ledbetter, and Dr. Rylander, who helped review our presentation and papers. So thank you guys very much.
Yes, we have time for questions. Reverend Leach.
As a behavioral medicine person, I just want to reinforce that research shows that referral to therapy for fibromyalgia, chronic pain, any central sensitization kind of issues is very important.
We agree.
We highly agree. Strength of recommendation A.
Would recommend.
Kind of along that, I don't think I saw like domestic abuse or violence anywhere mentioned on the differential, but that's something that I have seen in
Yes.
practice where people, I mean, had a lady that I kind of suspected it on, but she continually denied that she was in any form of abuse. Later comes back and seems like all of a sudden way better. I'm like, what's different? Well, I finally got away from my husband. He was abusing me. I ask about that so many times.
Wow.
And so just keep that in the back of your mind too. And that goes along with the referral for therapy too. Maybe they can kind of get to the bottom of some things sometimes because her fibromyalgia completely went away when she wasn't in that relationship anymore. So.
What a great reminder. So yes, please screen patients with that as well.
Dr. Morgan?
I have two questions. So study 3, gabapentin wasn't even in it, right? It was Lyrica. Why did you guys choose that study for your question?
Well, our topic was over gabapentinoids in general, so pregabalin and gabapentin both were in the family for us. So that's why we chose it.
And then my second question is, what do you make of the doses on the first study? They're pretty high. It was 1,200 to 2,400. Is that something that you guys are going to take away and maybe therefore choose higher doses in your patients that you're going to treat that way? What is your...
No, the studies actually, we didn't include this here, but the studies, whenever they were stratifying everything, the higher dosage wasn't different than like a more standard dosage. So I would always say like the lowest possible dosage.
Start
would be
low,
used.
go slow.
So you have a patient with fibromyalgia. One, how do you start them on what kind of treatment and which ones? Do you do one at a time? Not talking about medication right now, but the other ones first. And then second, well, I'll get to that.
So like the non-pharmacological options?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think given that aerobic exercise has the best studies behind it, best evidence, that would be the thing that I would go through with them first, along with the fact that we know it's very comorbid with mental illnesses. So that would kind of be my go-to, I think, would be talking to them about exercise and then talking to them about their mental health and seeing if we can get them to counseling services.
Yeah, I personally, whenever I talk with patients about mental health disorders, but also like people who have fibromyalgia that are kind of in a similar boat, I tell them I have a 5-step approach for how to manage it, and we want to hit it in as many ways as possible. So first, medicines are great. They have their place and their purpose, but in addition to that, sometimes there's things that can be an adjunctive thing. So exercise, like we talked about, diet, in addition, what you put into your body is kind of what you get out. So if you put in junk, it's kind of hard not to feel like junk coming out of your body as well. So that is also really, really important. in addition to how they talked about sleep hygiene, that also plays a really big role in helping you feel rested and kind of managing your perception of pain and symptoms whenever you're sleep deprived and you're just hurting all over is kind of accentuated. And then also for spiritual care and relational care, hanging on to your community and having somebody to kind of walk with you through that, in addition to counseling, I think is just a way to kind of tell them there's multiple ways that we're going to target this, and hitting it from all different aspects hopefully will get you the best response.
So you're starting with at least 4 of those to begin with.
Yeah.
And possibly medication as well.
Yes.
If you are going to start them on medication, new patient, not tried anything, which one do you choose?
I think that goes back to talking with the patient about maybe what they're comfortable with, if they've heard anything. As far as I know, the different medications between each other, like you can start any of them. But I think, I mean, honestly, personally, I'd probably talk to them more about the SNRIs, duloxetine kind of thing like that, because of the comorbid depression that's pretty common. So that's just me personally. I didn't specifically research about, like, you know, where to start, but I would agree that you probably would want to start with one and then, you know, work up if you need to see what's working for them.
Everything is kind of patient-centered, so I feel it's hard to have like a widespread, this is what I'm going to start with on all my patients, and so kind of seeing where they're at, other things they're dealing with, to see what is best and most beneficial.
Dr. Islander?
I've had a lot of patients like Dr. Windsor where they have a very firm diagnosis of fibromyalgia and then it automatically or magically goes away when something else is fixed in their life. Do you think that there's a subpopulation where this is really a disease, or do you think that this is a pattern of the way that our bodies react to overwhelming stress that's going on somewhere in our life?
I think that's a good question, and I think to the patients, I'm not sure that it matters so much. That's how I tend to counsel them about it, is that we don't exactly know what's causing it, but we do have physical manifestations of stress or mental things going on in our lives. So I don't know if we have that answer. I certainly don't. You might know, Dr. Islander.
So no, I don't. If that's going on, how does it confound your research? If it's really not a disease state, if it's a reaction to what's going on in our life, then you really can't research it the way that it's being researched. Look to your left.
I think Reverend Leach has our answer.
I will say that with fibromyalgia patients that I've worked with, it's not at all unusual that you can trace things back to some event, some trauma, something very anxiety provoking. And when they deal with that, their symptoms tend to decrease significantly and maybe even go away.
That is very helpful for our patients, and I think we're out of time, so thank you.
We would love to talk with you afterward if you have more questions.
So much movement and chatter. Fibromyalgia. It's a hot topic. If you need to go to the restroom, please do so quietly. Thank you. Next up, we have discussing the very important topic of peripartum pain management, particularly for the subset of patients who are undergoing medication-assisted treatment. We have Dr. Justin Silo and Dr. Caleb Jones.
Hello. All right, let's get started. So I'm Caleb Jones.
My name is Justin Silo, second year.
And our presentation is on the peripartum management of buprenorphine in pregnant women with opiate use disorder. We'd also like to take this time to thank Dr. Sarah Santiano, who was our faculty author, as well as Dr. Hildebrand and Dr. Ledbetter, who are our regional editors.
Thank you very much, y'all.
All right, so we're going to just run through a quick outline of our presentation here. We'll present a clinical case. We'll go through a background that's broken down into these topics here. We'll overview our methods that led to our evidence-based answer. We'll summarize our data, revisit or give our evidence-based answer, then revisit our clinical case, present our references, and take time for any questions. So we'll jump right in with our clinical case here.
All right, so our case is 31-year-old woman, G4P2 at 37 weeks, with history of opioid use disorder in remission for 16 months now. She's scheduled to undergo a C-section at 39 weeks. She's currently managed with buprenorphine and naloxone, or Suboxone as it's known, daily. What is the best strategy for managing her Suboxone to ensure her pain is well controlled throughout the peripartum period? Is it A, stop the Suboxone 7 and 2 hours prior to the C-section? Is it B, stop it at 38 weeks and provide her with 1 week of opioids to prevent withdrawal? Is it C, continue the Suboxone until her C-section and while she remains in the hospital? Or is it D, continue her Suboxone until her C-section, but discontinue it during the remainder of her hospital stay?
All right, so keep that question in mind. We'll come back to it later. So now we're going to go into what we've called the problem, which is where I convince you that our question was important. So we are going to go through some summaries specifically for opioid use disorder and some statistics. So from the World Health Organization, we see that worldwide 36 million people were diagnosed with a drug use disorder in 2019. So for the shock value, the total population of California is 29 million. So draw your own conclusions there. Also, 500,000 deaths attributable to drug use, also from the World Health Organization. 70% of those, or 350,000, due to opioids, and then 30%, or 150,000, due to a drug overdose. Comparatively, in the United States, we see that just over 2.5 million people diagnosed with opioid use disorder, and this data is actually from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Society of America. 40% of that 2.5 million, or just over 1 million, are receiving medication for addiction treatment. So just 40% of those patients. Now looking at pregnant women, a survey that was done found that 6.6 of pregnant women admitted to using opioids, and this survey was published by a journal out of Canada, the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. 27.1% of those women admitted to misusing opioids during pregnancy. And then the same article found that the incidence, I think it says prevalence up here, but that should be incidence of opioid use disorder in pregnancy, is 6.5 per 1,000 deliveries. Now, switching gears and looking at neonatal outcomes, there was a neonatal data presented in a healthcare cost and utilization project from the U.S. Agency of Health Research and Quality, estimated that the incidence of neonatal opiate withdrawal syndrome, NOWS, formerly known as neonatal abstinence syndrome, was 8.8 births per 1,000. So these are the tables out of that report from SAMHSA, just showing here the 2.5 million with the opiate use disorder diagnosis, and then also the just over 1 million who are receiving treatment. And that's treatment with medications for addiction. This is just a timeline. Typically, the opioid use, or the opioid epidemic, sorry, let me get it up here. There we go. It's talked about in 3 waves. So 1995, Purdue Pharmaceutical released oxycodone on the market. Is generally uses the first wave. Then the influx of heroin was the second, and then the third wave is commonly attributed to synthetic opioids, specifically fentanyl. So moving on to summarize this, we see this increasing incidence of opioid use disorder, leading to more patients being treated with buprenorphine. And there's really no standardized protocol for continuing or discontinuing medications in these patients, particularly when they come into the hospital for a procedure, for surgery, or delivery. And we've seen that in our own institution as well, that despite society guidelines, different anesthesiologists or providers may decide to discontinue or adjust the dose based on their own anecdotal evidence or experience. And then third, there's a historical fear of the antagonism of short-acting opiates in patients who are maintained on buprenorphine, so this fear that they won't be able to be adequately controlled from a pain management standpoint. So then that leads us to our clinical question.
So a clinical question here is, in pregnant women with opioid use disorder managed with buprenorphine, does discontinuing buprenorphine prior to labor improve the peripartum pain management? Go ahead. Here is our breakdown. So the population is the pregnant women, opioid use disorder, interventions stopping buprenorphine, comparisons continuing it, and outcome we looked at was the peripartum pain management. Next slide's me and my wife. This is at Doña Gloria's. It's a taco truck on the east side of Tulsa. It's really good. My wife is pregnant, but thankfully she's not have opioid use disorder, so very thankful for that.
So we're going to go into a quick overview. This slide is just a reminder of the mechanism of action and pharmacokinetics of buprenorphine. It's considered a partial opioid agonist, specifically at the mu-opioid receptor, which we see all the way on the far your left of the screen. I really just wanted to point out two things with this slide. One, what we call the ceiling effect, and two, the safety profile of buprenorphine. So the ceiling effect is used to describe as increasing doses of buprenorphine does not lead to higher levels of respiratory depression or levels of euphoria. And so that ceiling effect really leads to a pretty safe profile for the drug overall and limits the potential for overdose. So then this is just briefly some of the available formulations. I think it's important to note on this slide that some of the formulations are approved for both pain and opioid use disorder, so they may be the same formulation but under a different brand name. And then furthermore, the medications that are prescribed, particularly the sublingual and buccal formulations for opioid use disorder, also come in a mono product as well as a combo product. And so that combo product contains both buprenorphine and naloxone. And then when you talk about dosing, many studies have shown that for pain management, a split dosing regimen is more effective and leads to better pain control. So you'll see a subpopulation of people with opioid use disorder who are dosed more frequently, so 3 to 4 times a day. Many studies point out that maybe even as frequent as every 4 hours, as opposed to treating opioid use disorder, which is a once to twice daily dosing frequency. So then we're going to jump into our methods.
So in our methods, we looked at a couple of search engines here, including the PubMed, the TRIP database, Cochrane Library, ECRI, ACOGs. And out of all our searches, we identified about 540 studies. And out of those, we looked at about 25, just read the abstracts for relevance. We chose 7, and we reviewed fully, and then chose 2 for our references for this presentation.
So now we're going to jump in to summarize our data. The first study was a 2019 systematic review. It was titled The Perioperative Management of Buprenorphine, Solving the Conundrum. So this study included 5 cohorts and 7 case series or reports for a total of 460 patients included in this review. The aim was to review the available literature on the periprocedural management of buprenorphine in patients with opioid use disorder. So the overall results showed that 4 case studies for a total of 4 patients supported discontinuing buprenorphine in these patients. However, the overwhelming majority, 456 of the 460 patients in 5 cohort studies and 3 of the case series supported continuing buprenorphine. So we did our own subgroup analysis. The majority of the data in this review is presented qualitatively. So, and the vast majority of the literature, 393 of those 460 patients, were all pregnant women. So the 3 of the cohort studies and 2 of the case series with the 393 patients were all obstetrical studies. So we pulled these studies out and kind of analyzed them on our own. All of the data in this subgroup analysis was also reported qualitatively, which, with the exception of one study, which we'll go into a little more detail here. So this study. Myers in 2010 was a retrospective cohort study, included 63 participants. The population was pregnant women with opioid use disorder who were managed on buprenorphine, and this was the study group. This group was also divided into women who delivered by C-section and those who delivered by vaginal delivery. This was compared to a matched control group, and the primary and secondary outcomes were listed here, with opioid consumption in the postpartum period being the primary outcome, and then secondarily they looked at pain scores and then opioid consumption throughout the entire intrapartum period. And the opioid consumption was measured in oxycodone milliequivalents, which we've termed OME here as opposed to MME. So the results really showed that after vaginal delivery, there's no difference in opioid consumption between the two groups. There's also no difference in pain scores in these groups, or there was higher pain scores, in the women who were maintained on buprenorphine as compared to controls. So after a C-section, we saw both increased in opiate consumption as well as an increase in pain scores. So we took this data and presented it graphically here, so we can see over here, vaginal delivery, there was a significant increase in pain scores. So I'd like to point out that the values here are 2.7 versus 2.1. So while there is a significant difference, I would consider pain score less than 3 to be adequately controlled pain, both still very low. And then over here in the C-section delivery, again, if we look at on the left, the scale is measured from 0 to 6 as opposed to 0 to 10. So this was to highlight the difference between these data included in the graph here. So I think if we scaled this back from 0 to 10, the pain scores as a whole would look much lower than they do here. But again, we wanted to highlight this difference. So we do see a significant difference here again, but pain scores in the C-section group maintained on buprenorphine were still significantly lower. So the article also pointed out, this is also the graph for opioid consumption as well, that we saw no difference after a vaginal delivery and then a significant increase in the opioid consumption after a C-section. So the article also pointed out several risks of discontinuing buprenorphine, and really the top 3 are all relapse or return to opiate use. And we can see 3 different studies here that really show that there's a significant risk of these patients returning to opiate use if you discontinue this medication. So the conclusions from this study were, one, that effective pain control is possible when patients are continued on buprenorphine perioperatively, but also adequate pain control is feasible in pregnant women when they're maintained on their buprenorphine throughout the intrapartum period. As we just stated, thirdly, discontinuing buprenorphine carries a significant risk to return to opiate use. And then the study also pointed out that broad guidelines recommending discontinuation should really be reconsidered. The limitations of this study were the retrospective nature and the relatively small sample size. So that leads us on to study 2.
Yeah, so in study 2, this is done in 2022. It's a retrospective study. It's a matched cohort study with N of 92, titled Peripartum Postpartum Analgesia and Pain in Women Prescribed Buprenorphine for Opioid Use Disorder Who Deliver by Cesarean Section. So this looked at, in this study, the groups were matched pretty well on maternal age, primary insurance, indication for C-sections. Women who were excluded were multiple gestation pregnancies, chronic pain diagnoses, and opioid use during the 3rd trimester. So the aim of the study was to determine whether pain can be effectively managed during delivery in pregnant women with opioid use disorder who were taking buprenorphine and continued on it throughout the hospitalization. The study looked at primary outcomes of opioid utilization measured in morphine milliequivalents, and this does not include their buprenorphine dose in the study group, and also the pain scores ranging from 0 to 10. So it's just a table that kind of showed that the study group and the control group were matched pretty well. And so the study group was further stratified. So all the women in the study group, they were continued on their pre-hospital dose of buprenorphine, and then those women were further broken down into low dose, medium dose, and high dose, as you can see there, with the average of 14.6 milligrams. and the ranges on the dosage were 4 to 32. And I'd like to point out that in women who have, or in people who have opioid use disorder, specifically in pregnant women, the target dose of buprenorphine is about 16 milligrams. And so I think the average dose of 14.6 here is pretty comparable to the target dose. And so the results from this study showed, number one, that there was no difference in the pain scores in women on the buprenorphine versus controls at 12 to 24 hours post C-section. You can see there 5.03 for buprenorphine versus 4.93 for controls, and at 36 and 48 hours is they're the same at 4.4. So result number two, women taking buprenorphine had higher opioid utilization than the control group, 175 milligram on average versus 153, and that was statistically significant. And number three is among the stratified groups of the low, medium, and high dosage groups of buprenorphine, there was no difference in, statistically difference in opioid utilization, but as you can see, as the dosage of buprenorphine that goes from low to high, the opioid utilization kind of decreases as well. That's an interesting thing to note.
Yeah, and the authors pointed out that this could be attributed to the analgesic properties of buprenorphine itself.
And further,
Can we pause our time?
okay. All right, so this is just a graph that kind of pretty much just showing what I talked about earlier here. X-axis hours, Y-axis total morphine milliequivalents. As you can see, the exposed group had higher opioid utilization. And then the next graph there, it's showing the type of anesthesia that were received by these patients. And so the main takeaway from this graph is the spinal anesthesia along with morphine had the lowest pain scores compared to the epidural, general anesthesia, and spinal anesthesia. So conclusions from the study include, number one, individuals taking buprenorphine for management of opioid use disorder can achieve adequate post-surgical pain management without adjusting their pre-hospital dose of buprenorphine. And then two is further research is required to further determine the optimal buprenorphine dosing regimen during surgical hospitalizations. And limitations of this study include its a retrospective nature and also its smaller sample size.
So I just wanted to point out quick two phenomenon seen in opioid use disorder that may explain this increased opioid consumption we've seen in these two studies. And those are opioid-induced hyperalgesia and opioid tolerance. So these are both well-documented and seen not just in people with opioid use disorder, but who are maintained on opiates long-term. This hyperalgesia can set up this kind of perpetual feedback loop where a lower stimulus creates this elevated perception of pain, and then they seek more opiates, and those higher doses of opiates can actually many times worsen that hyperalgesia. And then opioid tolerance, typically those are actually overcome by higher doses of opiates. This is just a picture of my wife and I on our first mission trip together in Egypt. So we'll go back and revisit our clinical case.
All right, so let's revisit the clinical case. So we have this young lady who's pregnant who has opioid use disorder. She's going to go through a C-section. So what do you want to do for management of her buprenorphine? So maybe it'd be good to kind of poll the audience and see what you guys think with a raise of hands, if that's all right. So who picks A? Anybody? Dr. Rylander, is that you? No? No, you're just stretching. Okay.
B, anybody for B?
No B, okay.
Anybody for C?
C.
Overwhelming majority, fantastic.
Right. What about D?
We'll move
No
on.
D, okay.
So, yeah, it's correct. Based on our data, we have selected C as the correct answer. So back to our clinical question. In pregnant women with opioid use disorder managed with buprenorphine, does discontinuing buprenorphine prior to labor improve the peripartum pain management? So our evidence-based answer formulated from this data is that no, discontinuing it does not improve their peripartum pain management. So buprenorphine should be continued in the peripartum period for pregnant women with opioid use disorder, as adequate pain control can be achieved in these patients when maintained on buprenorphine. This is a strength of recommendation B. We also wanted to include here that While this wasn't the aim of the studies, these were themes in many of the studies, that discontinuing buprenorphine in these women may lead to poor acute pain control, as well as additional risk for both mom and baby, so return to opiate use, and then neonatal abstinence syndrome. And then we just included this for some next steps that just indicate that there's further research before we can really formulate some clinical practice guidelines. And we'll move on to our references here. Lots of them. And then we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Dr. Chung?
I was curious about like the safety profiles. Did you find data about the maternal and fetal outcomes when they use buprenorphine versus when they don't?
So not specifically, we didn't. So you're talking about more about babies than maternal?
Yes.
So there were some studies that hinted that, you know, the rates of neonatal abstinence with buprenorphine may be the same to use as when women are maintained on methadone, which has kind of historically been what's used, but not if they're not continued. You know, I think the risk, whether they're on the buprenorphine for as far as the fetus goes, you still have the risk of neonatal abstinence, but I think when moms are continued on it, there's, you know, the recommendations are they continue breastfeeding. And so I think you could speculate that if they are not continued, that you may have worse or higher incidence of higher NAS scores.
Yeah, so I think to kind of answer your question, so these two specific studies that we looked at didn't answer that question that you had, but based on the answer that they gave us, we can assume that it's okay and it's safe to continue the buprenorphine at the dose that patients were already on without much significant side effects or deleterious effects to mom and baby. The risk, as we mentioned, of discontinuing it are much higher than continuing it for both, specifically for mom. We didn't look at baby's outcome.
And this was the study I hinted to. It wasn't a planted question, but glad you brought it up. So I can pull this slide. The Mother trial was a huge study done in 2015, which is a head-to-head comparison of buprenorphine to methadone. And so they saw, these are, I think, in the context of that comparison, but less morphine for the treatment of neonatal abstinence syndrome or NAOS, and then shorter hospital stays. So thank you, great question. Dr. Morgan?
I'm just curious, when you guys were researching, you know, your article, like, who's doing the research? It's a big need in our country. It's not exactly something we want to deal with. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what we can look for as far as guidelines. Like, is there a big organization that's leading this, or is it just kind of all over the place?
So there are a handful of groups. Jones, one of the authors, not me, one of the authors that we included, was the one that headed the Mother trial. Our systematic review was an anesthesia group. We didn't present a protocol that they came up with because it was their anecdotal experience, but they had their own single system protocol. SAMHSA and ACOG both recommend against discontinuing. So they recommend that buprenorphine is continued in these women. So there are guidelines, but as far as what do you do with the dose? Do you approach a split dose regimen? Do you decrease it to try to allow a higher number of receptor availability for the short-acting opioids to work? That's really where we need a lot of work on figuring that out.
Okay, but look for ACOG and anesthesia guidelines.
ACOG, anesthesia, and ASAM. Yeah, that was SAMHSA, yeah.
Somewhat related question about the sample sizes were small.
Mm-hmm.
Any reflections or in your research you find out why are the sample sizes so small?
My first thought would be the stigmatization of the disease in itself, which I think is why, we saw 40% of these people with the diagnosis are receiving medication treatment for it. So I think the stigma plays a large role in that. I think a way to combat that would be to really get together a large multi-center trial that looks, throughout the entire United States.
Dr. Keller?
Yeah.
Can you help me out understand whether or not it'd be beneficial to remove the naloxone component for those on combo drugs for the postpartum pain management, because it seems like it would block other opioid benefits?
So the naloxone actually, when it's given PO, it's not effective. The only reason the naloxone is in that combination product is to try to deter IV drug use. So when you take the naloxone PO, it isn't metabolized. It doesn't have any efficacy. Naltrexone is the one that does have PO action. The naloxone is just to try to inhibit IV drug use for patients that may want to try to get high. But I am glad you brought up that question, because historically, a lot of the recommendations suggest transitioning women from the Suboxone to the Subutex, so from the combo product to the mono product. I would say that the data is kind of moving in the direction that supports the safety of naloxone in pregnancy. A lot of the societal guidelines, I don't know if I included it here, just say that further research is required to evaluate the safety of naloxone, both from a maternal and a fetal standpoint. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any others? Dr. Abraham.
Consumption was increased in the postpartum period. Did any of your research suggest that opiates should be prescribed postpartum deliveries for women with opiate use disorder?
You mean after hospitalization? No, I think it was, I don't think the follow-up extended outside of their immediate hospital stay. But that is a good question. Historically, I think people who have approached this as we should discontinue it, you would kind of have to cross-taper them to try to, prevent the cravings. And so, I think that's one of the situations. But specifically for sending them home, I think short follow-up may be the best approach to that. Dr. Eilander?
When you talk about a split dose regime, you're saying the person comes in, they're on their dosage of Suboxone, you increase that amount by 10%, divide it by 4, and give them that medication for both their use disorder and their pain control throughout the delivery process, basically. And
Somewhat. So the SAMHSA actually recommends against changing their dose. And I think one of our studies actually kind of recommended against that as well. But it would just be taking their total dose and then dividing that more frequently. Because I think the studies have shown that there's better pain control when the same total dose of buprenorphine is dosed more frequently. So that would be one of our questions. Is that a way that you could better manage their pain by dosing it Q4 to Q6 hours with the same total dose? I think whether you increase or decrease it by 10%, I don't think there's enough data to really say that. This is probably...
The point is that you wouldn't give them extra other things for pain control during that time.
I think from
In the hospital, you mean?
Right.
So I think from our studies, in terms of split dosing, generally these women come in with single dose regimens, daily dose regimens, and the recommendation is we just keep that and don't touch it. And in addition to that, for pain management, we can give them additional opioids on top of that and not really change their buprenorphine. I think that was the takeaway from the study.
Yeah, the guidelines say treat.
That's the quandary. I mean, that's what I'm asking about is,
Right.
do we split dose and increase and use that medication, or do we keep single dose and then give them other medications, knowing what we're giving them in the Suboxone is going to make that receptor not available?
Yeah. And so I think they recommend to treat the pain like you would any other patient that wasn't on it, with the expectation and the knowledge that they'll likely require more. So whether we, split it and then add more on top of that, that's a percentage of their base dose, I don't think we know. There is some research, we probably won't have time to go through all of this, but they use a carfentanil PET scan that looks at available receptors. And so these graphs kind of show the different doses, I think, and then the different time frames after a single dose that kind of shows you how much or what your receptor availability is. So we can see that about, I think, 8 milligrams, they have around a 50% or just under 50% receptor availability. Actually, it's lower than that. It's about a 30%, which theoretically, and I think this was the data that systematic review based their recommendations that they try to get people down to 8 milligrams, because at that point you have 30% receptor availability for the short-acting opiates. That was just their single center recommendation, and so I really think we need a lot of stronger clinical and not just preclinical data to help us figure out really what the best option is.
And I think we're
Dr. De Silva.
out of time on there.
On the topic of split dosing,
Oh, one more question.
isn't buprenorphine typically dispensed daily, and like they're observed taking that medicine to prevent diversion and like them like trying to abuse it? Like how would you go about split dosing for like 4 times a day in a patient that has to
Yeah.
go into
So that's a great question, and we'll answer it quickly. So early on, the way that I've seen providers do it, you may only get a day and you come in daily. That's more typical with methadone. When in the addiction clinic I'm with, they'll give them a week to start off, and then they'll kind of, as they build trust, as their drug screens are appropriate, they'll extend them on to 2 weeks up to a month. And so, I think they do split the pills. So, you do have to be careful with diversion in this group, but I don't think it precludes you from really managing them appropriately if they have comorbid pain and opioid use disorder. But thanks for that question. That's all the time we have.
Okay, that brings us to our break. So we will need to be back here at, let's go for 11:12. 11:12. We'll see you back. Presentation left. Now that you are refueled and ready to maintain attention, we'll get started. A final reminder for this morning, green sheets, fill out, turn in. Thank you so much. To close us out this morning, we have Dr. Hannah Shai presenting the benefits of supplementing with vitamin D to improve symptoms of premenstrual syndrome. Dr. Shai, please come up.
Again, my name is Dr. Hannah Shai. I'm one of the second years, and today we'll be talking about vitamin D supplementation for premenstrual syndrome. There we go. So we'll get right into it with our HCA question. So does supplementation with vitamin D reduce the severity of symptoms in premenopausal women with premenstrual syndrome? And before we get started, a thank you to my advisor, Dr. Ryan Tischler, as well as to Drs. Ledbetter, Hildebrandt, and Rylander for this whole process. Okay, so kick it off with a clinical question. You are seeing a 20-year-old in your office for follow-up on her premenstrual syndrome symptoms. She tells you that they're getting worse and she can no longer manage them without medication. However, she would like something that is a little more natural if possible. She has read that vitamin D could help and wants to know if you think this would be a good option for her. What is the most appropriate response? So here are our answer choices. Just think about this as we go through some of the data moving forward. Okay, so what is premenstrual syndrome, or PMS is the more common term. It is a group of physical and behavioral changes that occur during the 5 days prior to the onset of menses, and there's at least one symptom that results in economic or social dysfunction. And in order to classify this diagnosis, these symptoms have to be present for at least 3 consecutive menstrual cycles. So when we're taking a history, we need to be aware of those. And symptoms we classify into 2 different categories. They can be either affective or they can be physical. Some examples of affective would include things like depression, increased appetite, irritability, anxiety, or mood swings is what everyone will say when they come into your office. And then some of the more physical symptoms, bloating, fatigue, breast tenderness, headache, those kinds of things. So why do we care? We care because it is thought to occur in up to 12% of women. In addition, this can cause disturbances in regular function, quality of life, as well as social relationships, and it can lead to increased rates of absenteeism from work and or school, as well as poor scholastic performance, higher medical expenses, lower medical quality of life. As someone who has a patient panel full of young women, this is very important to me. I have this in my office at least once a week, if not more. So, but you know who doesn't care? This is my cat. Other people put up their children. This is my fur baby. She does not care. She cares about the sink. So, if you knew me, you definitely should have seen this coming. So, okay, so getting into the studies. The first study, the title is Vitamin D Supplementation for Premenstrual Syndrome-Related Inflammation and Antioxidant Markers in Students with Vitamin D Deficiency. This was a randomized controlled trial. Oops, sorry, wrong button. It was very small, an N of only 38. Inclusion criteria, again, these were mostly students, so women ages 18 to 25. In order to be a part of this study, they did have to have a diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency, and this was based on a vitamin D level less than or equal to 20. And they had to be diagnosed with PMS based on this PMS daily symptoms rating form. They used diagnostic criteria from the American Psychiatry Association. Primary outcomes that were measured included their serum vitamin D levels, inflammation and antioxidant markers, specifically IL-10, IL-12, and TAC, or total antioxidant capacity. The final was a mean score of the total PMS symptoms. Our treatment group received 50,000 international units of oral vitamin D once every 2 weeks for 4 months, and this was compared to placebo. All right, so when you look at our results, so this is our vitamin D group, this is our placebo group. These images are not coming up super great, but here is our vitamin D level, our serum IL-10 levels, 12, and TAC. To summarize all this data, we looked at baseline levels and post-intervention, and when you see this in our vitamin D group, obviously. Our baseline did increase. We also saw a decrease in serum levels of IL-10, as seen right here, IL-12, and we had an increase in our total antioxidant capacity. In addition, if you look at the mean score of PMS symptoms in our vitamin D group and our placebo group, so at baseline in our vitamin D group, and then they did decrease post-intervention. So it is important to note, though, if you look specifically at the PMS symptoms here, there was a statistically significant decrease in PMS symptoms for the vitamin D group. However, there was also a decrease in the placebo group. So, looking at study number 2, which was the association between vitamin D and premenstrual syndrome, it was a systematic review and meta-analysis. This was a very large systematic review, I would say almost 5,000 people. There were 5 interventional and 11 observational studies. There were 3 specifically that looked at vitamin D as monotherapy. Others looked at vitamin D plus calcium, calcium by itself. There were several other non-traditional pharmacologic methods. So for our intents and purposes, we're just looking at these 3. So our first one, our randomized control trial, looked at women ages 15 to 45 who were also diagnosed with PMS based on this daily symptoms rating from the APA. Primary outcomes were the mean score of total PMS symptoms. And this study was interesting. They looked at 3 different arms, actually. They looked at treatment with 200 milligrams of vitamin D daily for 2 months versus vitamin E supplementation versus placebo. So if you look at the results of this study, there was a decrease in the average PMS score that was statistically significant after treatment with vitamin D compared to baseline. However, when you also look at the decrease in placebo, there was also a decrease in the placebo group, so there was no statistical significance of this when you compared it to the placebo. Looking at our second study, another randomized clinical trial, very similar. This one were young women. They did actually have to have vitamin D deficiency. I apologize. This should say 20. And again, this is the American Psychiatry Association Daily Symptoms Rating Form is one of the standards, and this is what all of our studies used. This also looked at the mean score of total PMS symptoms, and then also looked at vitamin D levels pre and post treatment. So our treatment arm received an initial dose of 200,000 international units of oral vitamin D, and then this was a loading dose, followed by 25,000 international units every 2 weeks for 4 months. And this was compared to placebo. So, looking at this study, there was a decrease in average PMS scores compared to placebo with a statistical significance. And there was a specific decrease in each of the following symptoms, specifically anxiety, irritability, crying, and disturbed relationships, all of which had statistical significance. Excuse me. And in our treatment group, there was also an increase in vitamin D levels compared to the placebo. So looking at our third study, this was a quasi-experimental study that looked at women ages 12 to 18. And this study was a little different. They placed people into 4 different treatment groups. So there were people with a diagnosis of PMS, people with a diagnosis of dysmenorrhea, people with both, and then a control group. And they looked at the overall prevalence of PMS pre and post study. And in this case, all groups received 50,000 international units of vitamin D every week for 9 weeks. And this study did find a decrease in overall prevalence of PMS following treatment across the groups. Okay. This study additionally also looked at a meta-analysis of 7 observational studies. And when they looked at the meta-analysis, they didn't see any association between vitamin D supplementation and PMS. So what they did after this was they did a subgroup analysis, which was based on 3 different things. Study quality, so high quality studies versus moderate or low. Location, so a lot of these were done in Asia versus the United States. And then study design, looking at cross-sectional or case control studies. So there was a decreased heterogeneity, so they did see some more uniformity across the studies when they did this subgroup analysis. However, there was still no association between vitamin D supplementation and PMS. Okay, that was a lot of data. So looking at study 2 specifically, to just kind of break it down. So study number 1 said no, there's no statistically significant decrease compared to placebo. Study number 2 said yes, there was a decrease in PMS symptoms compared to placebo, specifically in these 4 areas as previously mentioned. And study 3 said there was a decrease in prevalence of PMS following intervention. But our meta-analysis didn't show any association. So we have some mixed results here. Now, our third and final study was titled The Effect of Vitamin D Supplementation Consumption on Premenstrual Syndrome in Vitamin D Deficient Young Girls. So this was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, and it did specifically look at women with vitamin D deficiency. So women ages 18 to 30, they had to have a vitamin D level less than 20. However, this one was looked at the premenstrual syndrome symptom screening tool, which was based on the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. The primary outcomes that we looked at were vitamin D levels and severity of PMS symptoms, both pre and post intervention. The treatment group received 2,000 international units of oral vitamin D every other day for 3 months versus placebo. In the results of this study, there was a decrease in the following PMS symptoms when compared to baseline. So looking specifically at nervousness, job activity reduction, social activity reduction, fatigue, and then they kind of, this one clumped all the physical symptoms into one category. They looked more at the emotional, psychosocial. Those were the ones that were split up, so they lumped all of those physical symptoms together. However, though there was statistical significance in this study arm, these were not significant when they compared to placebo. So they also showed similar different decreases in the placebo group following the intervention period. Okay, that's a lot of data. So we get 2 fun slides. I asked my mom if I should put in our family, and she said, let's be honest here. Oh, never mind. So this is just a nice little table that shows everything that I talked about. See, this is what I mean in particular, where they just lumped all the physical symptoms and they looked more at their at the psychosocial symptoms. Okay, so there was all of our data. I asked my mom if I should say, hey, look, here's my family so everyone can kind of see what's going on. She said, let's be honest, you only care about the cats. So these are my parents' cats. They're all terrible. I won't get into it. You know, they're terrible. Dr. Place is probably shaking his head at me. He can't handle it. Okay. All right, so we're going to go back to our practice question. And so looking at the data that we've kind of gone through, we can look at it again. So we have a 20-year-old female in our office, follow up on her PMS. She tells you her symptoms are getting worse. She needs some treatment, but she wants something more natural. So what would be a good option for for the most appropriate response? So yes, of course, there's plenty of data which supports vitamin D as a viable non-hormonal treatment option. B, it is not likely to help, but also won't cause much harm. C, it may be a viable treatment option, particularly if the patient also has vitamin D deficiency. Or D, no, and this would actually cause more harm than good. So,
but is she vitamin D deficient in this question?
We're going to get there. I promise. We're going to get there. So, the answer is actually C. It may be a viable treatment option if she's vitamin D deficient. And so that leads me into my evidence-based answer, which says, vitamin D supplementation may be associated with a decrease in symptoms of PMS in women with pre-existing hypovitaminosis D. Okay, so Dr. Shinkaringo had a good point. Is she vitamin D deficient? So that kind of comes into our practical application moving forward. So as we've gone through all of this data, there's mixed evidence that says vitamin D supplementation can help in premenstrual syndrome. There's a little bit better evidence that says if they're vitamin D deficient. However, we would then have to prove a coexisting vitamin D deficiency. So we have a couple of options. In looking forward to how you're going to manage this in your practice, what I was thinking as I was going through all this data was, okay, so if I have a patient who comes to me and they're having all of these symptoms that are consistent with PMS, they have a prior diagnosis, would it then be a viable option to screen them for vitamin D deficiency? And my first thought was yes, why not? If we screen them for vitamin D deficiency, maybe that's attributing to some of their symptoms. We have a relatively safe, easy fix. However, if we can get it approved by insurance, what I'm seeing in my clinic is trying to get vitamin D levels approved for purely screening purposes, unless you can back it with whatever varying symptom, or they have a previous diagnosis of vitamin D deficiency. That can be a little bit challenging. So, you know, there are a wide variety of vitamin D deficiency symptoms that you can probably bill and code and then get your vitamin D level from there. Another option, if you really can't get that done, would be to trial vitamin D supplementation. All these studies did really show a high dose, but you could trial something that's like in our second study, 400 every day, something that's smaller, relatively low risk, and kind of see if there is any improvement if you can't get that testing done. So, but also thinking about that, you would think this needs to be a joint decision-making process with your patients, okay? Let me see. So another thing that I was thinking about as I was looking at practical application is PMS is one of those that, yes, there are physical symptoms, but it's a mood disorder. There's a lot of psychosocial types of things that go into this, and I apologize, that's not included in this slide. And so, you know, I don't want to sound like a broken record, like what Dr. Phillip was saying earlier. Here at IHI, we care about the whole person. We care about spiritual care, and I think in patients who come to me who have these particularly disturbed relationships, they're depressed, they have all these other things, regardless of whether it's because they have PMS that needs treatment, they have coexisting mental illness, any of those things. Spiritual care plays a big role in treatment of our patients, and I think this is a really great example. Like I said, as someone who sees a lot of young women in my practice, spiritual care, counseling, mentoring, those are big components to what I do personally. And so this would just be one option of a multitude of different things that I would throw at them, both mostly non-pharmacologic methods. So all that to say, whole person care is important. So that is my last slide. I just have references moving forward, but I will take any additional questions. Dr. Jones, how could I have guessed?
Can you just go back to the inflammatory market slide with all your interleukin?
Yes, I can.
I just want to look at it. If anyone else has a question, go ahead.
Oh, okay, so we're gonna go all the way back to the beginning, which is taking me 30 minutes. I'm exaggerating. So we're gonna go all the way back to this so Dr. Jones can look at it. Do you want me to read things to you? Okay. Dr. Lee, you have a question as well, sir.
I have two.
Okay.
How did you decide to look at vitamin D for PMS? And three, is there literature to suggest that in patients with PMS there is a higher prevalence of vitamin D deficiency?
Oh,
or
great
vice
questions.
versa, patients with vitamin D deficiency?
Right, great questions, both of those. So, looking, like I said, in my practice, I have a lot of young women. I have a lot of mood disorders. I have a lot of these kinds of things in my clinic. So I was looking for something in our FPIN that would be practical for me. And in just looking out through the literature, vitamin D and calcium were the two hot topics. And so I was like, pick one or the other. I thought vitamin D would be interesting to move forward and could potentially be more practical for me. And then to answer your second question, I did not see anything in the literature specifically to suggest that there is an association between vitamin D deficiency and PMS symptoms. I don't think that's been adequately studied. Looking at data, you might be able to make some conclusions on your own. However, there is nothing, as far as I have read, that can provide that answer conclusively. Dr. Ng.
Having mention reproductive age women, would starting them just on like prenatal vitamins also kind of cover for this? Like they should be looking at prenatal vitamins?
I mean, probably. I mean, if they're also vitamin D deficient and, you know, we have vitamin D in the prenatal vitamin that's going to help them out here, I don't see why not. So, Dr. Bothwell?
So not all vitamin D is created equal. So you know, like vitamin D2 versus D3. I know there's research that support vitamin D3. Were all these studies vitamin D3?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. Looking at, they were all the same vitamin D. Dr. Leo?
Hey, thanks. It was a great presentation. But in your practice, do you, as you mentioned, a lot of people with PMS also have comorbid mental illnesses and things like that. So in your practice, do you also counsel them to maybe like go outside, get some sunlight, maybe some exercise, and all of those things would also help their mood disorders while maybe also helping their vitamin D levels?
Yes, and anyone who knows me knows that I love being outside and I love exercise, and I'm always going to be a proponent. As I previously stated, when I counsel patients, I think as most of us do here, it really is a whole person type of approach. So when I have anyone who comes to me with any kind of mood disorder, PMS not included, I don't necessarily tell them to go run because I know that that's difficult for a lot of people. But I kind of have a multiple pronged approach to when I talk to patients about this. And so looking at, diet choices, exercise, even just being in the sunlight, kind of meeting that patient where they're at as far as like, I can't go ask you to run a marathon, but I can ask you to walk your dog once a day or things like that. And then again, as previously stated, spiritual care, I am the biggest proponent of counseling, probably second to Rev Leach. So I will always with my ladies with mood disorders talk about that as well. Dr. Kuchmi?
So I had a question. One of the studies had a really high dose of vitamin D. Was there a specific reason why that was done? And then do we know, is there like a limit? I feel like I've learned that there's a threshold that after which you're not absorbing much of it.
Yeah. I don't think that study particularly explained why they chose. None of them really explained why they chose the levels of vitamin D supplementation that they did. You are right in stating that there is kind of that limit. But yeah, I don't know if I can speak to what the researchers, what their decision was behind that. Dr. Jones has a real question this time.
Yeah. Do you know how they looked at levels of these interleukins? Was it, I guess, from photography or mass spectrometry?
I'm not sure. I don't know. That was buried in the weeds.
I'm just curious because a lot of times when having done research in inflammatory conditions, you'll look at like the whole spectrum more than just like IL-10
Right.
and IL-12 because you're capturing the stage or the component of just the macrophage mediated inflammation
Right.
without neutrophilic or any of the other acute phase things. So I was just curious if there's any reason why they didn't include like IL-6 or IL-8 or some of the other markers.
Yeah. No. I think the biggest one. Yes, they included 10 and 12, but it looked like the biggest thing that they cared about in the study was the total antioxidant capacity in particular when looking at those markers. So. Yeah, I can't speak to why they chose those two in particular. We have so many questions. This is what I get. Dr. Shinkaringo, did you have a question?
So do women with normal vitamin D level, can they benefit from vitamin D supplementation just because women is a higher level?
Is that an option? These studies would say no, looking at this data, that there has to be a deficiency that is made up in order to see some alleviation of those symptoms. However, in practice or anecdotally, I'm sure providers would say different things of like if I'm at the low level of normal for my vitamin D, if I bring it up to more mid-range or on the upper level of normal, if that would improve. There might be anecdotal reasoning for doing that, but as far as these studies are concerned, no.
So this is about the inflammatory markers and antioxidant. My question is, why did they do that in that study?
Yeah. So based on my understanding of the study, the authors were of the belief that PMS is that it is a type of inflammatory response, and so if we're managing that, if we can manage the inflammatory response, can we manage the subsequent symptoms of that? And that was what was laid out in that study. So, yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Who has another? Yes.
So for the fact that sometimes, if they have inflammatory markers that are high, I don't know if you mentioned if they're also being treated with anti-inflammatory medicines like NSAIDs or.
Yeah, that was not commented on in this study. So.
Did you come across any studies that looked at how much percentage overlap there is between symptoms of hypovitaminous D and PMS? And then, because if we're only treating the women with low vitamin D levels, then are we really just
Treating their vitamin D.
deficiency?
Right,
And not
treating their vitamin D deficiency. Yeah, again, when looking through the literature, there wasn't, there were no specific conclusions that were made as far as, I mean, if you look at the symptoms of PMS and you look at some of the symptoms of vitamin D, there is overlap, but there's overlap in, that's also, I mean, you could say the same thing for depression, anxiety, any other type of mood disorder that's overlapping. I think what's very specific about PMS is the cyclical nature of it. And so I would imagine someone with vitamin D, the most common one is fatigue. That's more constant, whereas opposed to these symptoms are very specific. 5 days before I start my period into it, they go away once I start, and then that cyclical process continues. So that would be my way of differentiating them. Dr. Morgan.
So just anecdotally, I mean, all these things in this population are like fads and hip and cool, right?
Yes,
And it actually is a really great opportunity when they bring these types of things to talk about like their whole life. I've had patients who've like changed their diet in part because of some of these symptoms and really made progress in their whole life. And I have some who don't,
Yes, ma'am.
And so just encouraging people of all of that. It's like, hey, if you're just gonna take a multivitamin and stop eating at McDonald's, yeah, your periods are gonna get better, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, your endometriosis will feel better because you're not consuming all this inflammatory junk.
Exactly.
So, yeah, they may come to you specifically asking about the vitamin D, and you can address it, but it's like.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And as I stated before, I mean, we all take that big approach.
Take care of young women, they're all gonna ask you this.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been a lot.
Somebody posted it on TikTok, so now it's like.
All about the TikTok nowadays. So. Yes, Dr. Williams.
I have a question. Several years ago, it was reported both in adult literature and also pediatric literature that vitamin D insufficiency was much more prevalent. Since that's been known for a number of years, has there been any increase in or decrease in the incidence of PMS after they became aware that we were having a population that's been deficient in vitamin D and supplemented it more? I'm assuming that's been occurring. Has that had any effect on the incidence of PMS?
That's a great question. These articles did not comment on that. My understanding is, relatively speaking, some of these kind of guidelines are a little bit newer, as in not from the in the last 20, 30 years newer. So I can't really speak to that. That would be a very interesting study moving forward, though. Dr. Crouch.
You seem to be the ideal one to ask this question. Do cats have PMS because they?
So yes. So speaking, that was the best question to end on. No, I don't think that cats' orneriness is cyclical. I think it's all the time. I can speak to that about all 4 of the ones that I showed you, who are all girl cats, by the way, which makes that funnier. So, but the moodiest cat I ever had was the old man cat. So, I mean, these guys shaking their heads, they know because they met him. So, anyways. All right. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you guys for your attention during all of those presentations and for your questions. We just have a few announcements before we wrap things up for the morning, and most of them are about food, so pay attention. First thing is tomorrow morning breakfast. Just wanted to announce that's from 8:30 to 9:30. Second thing is tonight dinner is at 5 p.m., and then we're going to have our meeting with everybody at 6 p.m., and we're doing international dress tonight, so that will be fun. And then the last thing is make sure your green CME forms are filled out and put them in the baskets at the end of the tables, and we'll pick them up. And the sign-in sheet. Sign that.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for this morning, your attention, and so kind. So I'd like to just go ahead and pray for us and dismiss us for lunch, if that's okay. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father God, we thank you so much. God, you love us so much, and you brought all of us here together and from various walks of life. And as we learned through devotional morning, Lord, and you are our bread and you are our source of life. And so we thank you for that, God. And we thank you for the food. We pray you bless the people that prepared it for us. We pray that the food be nutritious to our bodies. And we pray that you keep us safe through all the different activities that we'll do tonight, and help this weekend be a time of refreshment, of good fellowship, and just increased joy in you. And we pray this in Christ Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.